Hey,
All right.
let's do something here.
Okay.
Okay.
Paul Perry, Dr. Raymond Moody, thank you guys so much for being here
Hey,
today.
thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us, Justin. This is great.
So I was told you guys have a relationship that um, has been ongoing for decades. So can you tell me kind of how you guys started working together and lead up to writing books together?
Well, we both have the same agent, Nat Sobel in New York, and I was This was in probably 1989 or something, 1988, and I was editing a magazine. I was executive editor at a magazine called American Health Magazine. It was the most successful and popular magazine of the 80s. And one day, Nat calls me up and says, "Let's go to lunch. I want you to write a book uh, with Raymond Moody." And I said, "I don't know who Raymond Moody is." And he said, "Well, he's the guy who named and defined the near death experience." I said, "I don't really know what that is. I know a little bit about going up the tunnel and things, but I don't know much about it at all." And he said, "Well, he literally said this: For a guy who's the editor of a major health magazine, you can be pretty ignorant sometimes." So you need to go to Alabama, and well, it was Georgia at the time. You need to go to Georgia and talk to Raymond about this book. So I did, and I had an immediate affinity for Raymond, and he's wonderful to work with. He's very direct, very smart, and if he doesn't know something, he'll say, "I don't know it." And so I kind of moved in with Raymond for a couple of weeks, and then later subsequent times, and we wrote the first book we wrote together was The Light Beyond. And at the end of writing that book, I said, there's a gap in books. There's a gap here because there's nothing about children who have had near death experiences. And Raymond says, "Oh, there's not much research on that. I know a pediatrician in Seattle, Melvin Morris, who's just about ready to start working on research on children and NDEs. I'll call him for you." And he called him, and I went to see Melvin, and we wrote the book Closer to the Light, which was a huge bestseller at the time. And after that, every time we'd find gaps in anything we were working on, that became our next book.
Hmm.
And so we kind of went from gap to gap. That's how I saw it, Raymond.
Yeah, that was my memory too. And we had a great time. We've always been it's just been fun with Paul. That's what can I say? I just uh the personal thing is one thing. He's a great guy. And in terms of the professional thing, philosophers ask one kind of question and doctors ask another kind of question. So I covered those two fields, but Paul is a journalist, and journalist asked a different kind of question or a different sequence of questions, and I think that's a very good point because see, yeah, I was a professor of symbolic logic, Justin, and I mean, you know how socially apt that I am, right? And when somebody asks me a question, I answer as a logician. And for example, for decades, I started working on this back in at University of Virginia in the late '60s, and then at East Carolina University, where I was a philosophy professor in '69 to '72. And as soon as I got known for this just welter of people coming up, Raymond, is there any kind of proof? And well, my mind would go to Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein and the Principia Mathematica, I mean, all this stuff. And and I would, people just got dull glaze over. And it took me literally, decades to realize what the average person who asked me, is there a proof of life after death, is asking is number one, usually in the context of personal fears or curiosity, and very often in the context of having lost a loved one to death. See? And that kind of person is not going to be interested when you talk about Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead and the how you can reduce mathematics to the axioms of logic. I mean, but what are they talking about? I understand the concept of proof very well, as much as the logician does. And I know on that ground, and I can say this with complete confidence, that the major logical and philosophical objections to the notion of an afterlife, that the great philosophers of history, including Plato and David Hume, and more recently, A.J. Ayer and the logical positivist in the 20th century, they made very valid and very major objections to the very notion of an afterlife. Now that is reality. And I would not be saying what I am now I'm about to say unless I know that is now taken care of. Those old objections no longer apply because of new developments in how you think about things that are unintelligible, essentially. So that part is all taken care of. We now have ways to actually find real, inroads into the afterlife question. And so I feel free then to say to people, yeah, there's an afterlife. And I think it's now possible to say, yeah, there's a kind of proof of an afterlife in that sense that people are interested in. And it boils down to this. Is it a rational thing for someone to anticipate and expect that when you die, you will have these, enter another realm of existence? And I say absolutely yes. That is a completely rational position. And one that I have finally been driven into. I give up. I've never bought that thing about, oh, this is oxygen deprivation to the brain. That argument goes back to Plato and Democritus, the atomist in ancient Greece. And that was before they had the notion of oxygen. But Democritus, who was an atomist, said, yeah, these things happen. These people apparently die, and they come back and they tell you the story. He said, but there's no such thing as a moment of death. All that is the invisible biological activity that's still persisting in the body. Meanwhile, Plato said, yeah, this is real. So that's the debate we're still having, right? The people who say, yes, life after death. Other people say, no, it's oxygen deprivation to the brain. The trouble is, with the objection is that bystanders at the death of someone who does die have all of these same experiences that we call the near-death experience. They say, as grandma died, I got out of my body, I went through partway toward this light with her, then I came back to my body. Or people say the room filled up with light and spirits. I saw spirits of grandma's deceased relatives and so on coming into the room to take her away, including, Justin, I got plenty of cases of people who say that they empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person. And for decades, I thought, well, that's got to be somebody very intimate with the person, right? A close relationship. But no, so a few years back, Cheryl and I got a communication from an ER doctor who was called to resuscitate a patient he had never seen before. And as this guy was dying, he said this review of the man's life came around. And, it's like some people are so afraid of that information. People have always been afraid of the unexplained. And they're going to people to this day, oh, this is oxygen deprivation to the brain. That is not reason. That is, they're trying to conform to this traditional way that has been debated. But in reality, this has long since burst out of that framework of the life after death or oxygen deprivation to the brain. This is not oxygen deprivation to the brain. However, that does not imply that, therefore, it is life after death. See, there's a big gap there. And so where I have come over the decades is I just give up. I am a skeptic in the real sense. These ignoramuses who, I'm a skeptic about the near-death experience. I just think it's the chemistry of the brain. Well, what a skeptic is was defined by Pyrrho, the ancient Greek philosopher, Hellenistic philosopher. And basically, what it means is that mode of inquiry where you do not draw a conclusion, but rather just try to knock everything down, right? Why? Not just out of cantankerousness, but you find after you do it for a while, it really expands your mind. And secondly, since everybody else is rushing in this direction to get to a conclusion, but you're holding back, then so you see the side pathways. And that's what a skeptic is. And now run that knowledge back by these morons who tell, oh, I'm a skeptic about the near-death experiences. I think it's the chemistry of the brain. If you unpack that remark, it is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. These people don't know what they're talking about. This is a very important question. And we got to face up to the fact that we can't solve the afterlife problem with the mind and the logic that we have now. However, it is perfectly possible, and I have done it literally hundreds of times, to reformat people's minds so they can think about this question in an entirely new way. And then, once they know that, then when they subsequently have a near-death experience, they will no longer be baffled by the ineffability problem. It's already happened once. A man who took one of my seminars, very distinguished artist and scientist, took one of my seminars, then years later had a near-death experience. And to make it short, he completely confirmed why I said that this is going to transform your way of reporting your experience. And therefore, we already have thousands of cases viewed through the lens of Aristotelian logic, right? Which makes it a travel narrative. But something is very wrong here, because what these people say is, look, I have no words for it. It was not in time. Time just vanished. It was not space. Space just vanished. But the only way I can describe it to you is I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I met my deceased relatives, saw my life in review, came back to my body and returned to life. That is a travel narrative. But what meaning does a travel narrative have if there's no time and space? You know, when Lincoln was president, there was a very formal state ceremony. I forgot what it was. But his people were all gathered around, and his part called for him to mount a horse, and lead a procession away from the scene. So when he got up on the horse put its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse was bouncing around. Everybody shocked into embarrassed silence for the president. But Lincoln just looked down at the horse and said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And people just dissolved into laughter. Well, if you think about it, that is nonsense to say that a horse could put its hoof in a stirrup and climb aboard, right? But nonetheless, it creates a very vivid image in your mind of that scene. And that's really the major stumbling block. Now, when somebody goes into a near-death experience with this knowledge already, they're going to realize this. So when somebody in a clear state of consciousness bumbles into talking nonsense and you point it out to them, say to the coach says, you guys pair up in threes, right? And you say to the coach, just a minute here, pair up means twos, and he would correct himself. Similarly, when somebody goes into a near-death experience with this new logic in their mind, they'll say, oh, I can't say that it's a travel, and I'll put it in a new way. Now, that gives us parallax. Everybody knows that it's 4.3 light years out to Alpha Centauri. But very few people have ever said, well, how do we know that? You can't send a homing pigeon out there with an odometer. So the reason they know is that by the 19th century, they got the measurements were close enough, so they realized that for nearby stars, when the Earth is here in its orbit, you measure the angle to a star. Then you wait exactly 6 months till it's 886 million miles away. You measure the angle again. You could see there'd be a little difference, right? Now we got that method for the afterlife. We already know what it looks like through the lens of Aristotelian logic. It looks like a travel narrative. But now we understand why that doesn't work. In the future, we will have additional accounts that are viewed not only through the lens of Aristotelian logic, but through also additional principles of how you think about things that are unintelligible. And when you put that together, it will give you a stereo view. I am happily to say now, I can build an observatory where people can peer into the other world. But that observatory is not going to be staffed by people like parapsychologists. This is a totally different approach. This is conceptual. And I have always said in my books and in my personal talks and all, somebody who tells you that that the question of life after death in 2024 is a scientific question don't know what they're talking about. That is the fact. It's just plain fact. And the refusal to acknowledge that fact is the main thing that's holding back rational investigation of the most important question of existence.
Where do you want to go after that?
It's there's so many places I guess we have to go.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, that's a great summary though of near-death experiences. But let me ask you this specifically for Dr. Moody. Although, let me also say that, Paul, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too. Did you come into we spoke with Bruce Grayson, and his approach coming in? He had a very materialistic worldview that he had kind of been raised with, and he talks about that a lot, about how that impacted how he approached his research. Did you guys have any worldviews, any thoughts on life after death, religious affiliation, anything like that before you started the work that you do?
My dad was a medic in World War II and a surgeon who was in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And I never thought about this until years later, but when I was a kid, the way I experienced it, my dad was very sarcastic and hostile about religion. And I grew up thinking that religious people were just not too smart. And my love was astronomy. And when I went to the University of Virginia in the age of 18 in 1962, and I took a philosophy course, that was the first I had ever known of anybody who took the question of an afterlife other than a cartoon premise. I remember there was this great Jack Benny movie in maybe the late 40s or early 50s, which was my Aunt Edna took me to this Jack Benny movie. It's something about angels and all that. That was my image of the afterlife, that it's some kind of going up and out. But I thought that was just a fiction movie. But you can imagine my shock when I realized that Plato became my hero on page 2 of the Republic when I was 18. Oh my God, who is this guy? And the fact that he took the question of an afterlife not only seriously, but took it to be the most important question of existence was what woke me up to it. And I studied Plato's analysis and Democritus' analysis of these near-death experiences, never understanding that it didn't occur to me, oddly, that it might still be going on. I thought it was a Greek thing. Then in 1965, I met a physician, a psychiatrist who was a professor at UVA, Dr. George Ritchie, who had had such an experience. That was the first one I heard. To this day, George is the finest person I ever knew. I just was blown away. Not to the point of saying that there's an afterlife, but to say that there's something here I don't understand. And where I finally come, Justin, is, it's still very counterintuitive to me, but I got to say I give up. I just can't argue the contrary now, because one part of it is, I have so many medical friends whose judgment I would trust absolutely, who have had profound near-death experiences. Unanimously, they tell me that, yeah, not only was it real, it was more real than what you and I are going through now. And so I asked myself, I hope you've seen Dr. Anthony Cicoria, the professor of orthopedic surgery at NYU and MD, a PhD in physiology. esteemed professor of orthopedic surgery who was struck in the neck by a bolt of lightning, resuscitated on the spot by a nurse who was there, got out of his body, went through just amazing into a hyper reality. Then, after, although he never had any interest in music before, developed a fascination with the piano, started studying the piano, had this recurrent dream in which he was playing this piece, learned how to play the transcribed music so he could play it. And now, in addition to being an esteemed professor of orthopedic surgery, is also a concert pianist who had a concert in Vienna recently. And that does not fit into ordinary consensual reality. That is something that is outside of the frame of the presuppositions that make up this place that we're in. And many people are just terrified to admit this kind of thing. They want to stay with these old epiphenomenalistic views of the consciousness and so on because they're scared. And I'm scared too, but I'm scared by a different range of. Many people are afraid to say, I don't know. That's an easy one for me. And it's very hard for me to say, I know. But there are just many other people who are just wired the different way, I guess.
And we do, in regard to that, people who pick up new skills and knowledge. We have a lot of people who have picked up skills and knowledge and change as a result of a near-death experience. They say they're kind of downloaded by information from the universe. Uh,
Yeah.
Most of them, interestingly enough, forget a large portion of what they are downloaded with, but they still come back intellectually changed. Uh,
Yeah.
like Tony is one, but we have another one. Like we have a lot, but we have Rajiv Party, who's another medical doctor. We're going through a period now where a
That's
lot of
a
medical
power
doctors
hit
are
here.
telling us their stories.
Hello?
In the beginning, when we were writing books, they didn't want to talk to us at all, and now it's all changed.
Hello?
And we run into doctors who have picked up new knowledge and changed their life completely as a result of a near death experience. Like
Hello?
for example,
We had
Rajiv
a
Party is a
power
good
hit.
one. He's was the head of anesthesiology at Bakersfield Heart Hospital, and he had a near death experience. And during the course of his near death experience, he encountered two angels, and he went into a field of bright light where he was counseled by a higher being, put it that way, higher than the angels. And the angels told him that he needed to quit medicine because he was going through some addiction problems, and he needed to quit being an anesthesiologist and go into what they called consciousness-based medicine. And he said, "Well, what is consciousness-based medicine?" And they said, "Well, we can't tell you. You have to find it yourself." So he did quit as the head of anesthesiology at Bakersfield, and he is currently searching for what consciousness-based medicine involves. And with him, he's gone into the field of addiction medicine, helping people who have become addicted. And he's building a thriving practice based on that, which is his definition of consciousness-based medicine. But people have these near-death experiences, and they make profound changes in their life, uh, and it's as a result of new information that comes into them. We have other people like what is it, David Ditchfield? I'm not really familiar
Oh,
with him, but
yeah.
he was standing on a platform at a train in England, and the train caught his tie and dragged him off the platform and down the tracks. And at the end of that experience, which was a genuine near-death experience in every way, he started to practice piano. He became infatuated with music, practiced piano, and now he's become an excellent pianist. So
Yeah.
it's
And then the doctors, Justin, it's like, well, take Anthony, for example, uh, the orthopedic surgeon. Is I am, as Paul will tell you, not a virtuous exerciser, but an exercise addict. I mean, I just go berserk if I miss 2 days. Now I've got to do it walking. Okay. Now I ask myself, if heaven forbid I should hurt my foot, would I go to my friend Anthony, who's an orthopedic surgeon, and put my foot and life in his hands? Knowing full well that he says, yeah, I went to the other side and it's more real than here. Yes. So, you see, to me, it's hard to reconcile. It's like, how can I be willing to put my life in my friend's hands if I had a medical issue, but to doubt their unanimous conviction that all have that far from being dreamlike, this was more real than real.
I mean,
So I give up.
what is it?
I give
What
up.
is it that's out there and can give you new knowledge that completely changes your life and completely changes your profession? And I don't know. I have no idea. But somehow people tap into it, and you hear it frequently. People say they leave their bodies, they go to a heavenly realm. One of the frequent heavenly realms is a library of light, and they connect with that library of light, and they're given profound changes in their temperament and profound changes in their knowledge. It's and even their abilities to have verifiable psychic experiences. I mean, I was involved in this research. It was called the Seattle study at the time. I think it was the transformation study eventually, where 600 and some experiencers, near-death experiencers, were tested by a number of doctors with a number of instruments, mainly questionnaires, things like that. And it was found that number one, a near-death experience stays with them their entire life. And the definition that was given to them in this study was that they become type A without the anger. And another element is that they have 4 times as many verifiable psychic experiences as people who have not had a near-death experience. And a verifiable
Well, what would be how would you define like a verifiable psychic experience?
a verifiable psychic experience. I actually got one. I get a lot of mail, and so does Raymond. I got one the other day from a CFO at a company, and uh, he had witnessed. He was working at night at his desk, thinking about whatever it was he was working on, and all of a sudden he started to have the sensation that somebody close to him had just died. And so the verifiable part of this is he immediately talked to his wife. And he said, I just had a sense that somebody close to us had died. No name associated with it, but someone close to us had died. And he found out the next day that one of his best friends had passed away at that very time the night before. And so that is a verifiable psychic experience. Stronger ones are people who say, well, I had a dream that I shouldn't get on that plane today, and they tell somebody else that I'm sorry, I'm canceling my flight because I had a dream because that the plane was going to go down, and the plane does go down. That's a very dramatic one, but they're out there. That's a very
And it makes an impression on people mostly if it happens to them.
oh, of course, yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. I had which it happens to so many people,
Hmm.
and it really changes your view. I lost my first child at the age of 36 hours in 1970. 24 hours before it happened, my wife dreamed that it happened. We both woke up having the same dream that she was losing the baby and that I was dreaming my part, like driving down to the hospital. I saw her obstetrician. It was a 3 people practice. She had only seen one guy. I knew that guy, but when in the dream, I saw this guy with long brown, sort of lion colored hair and a plaid shirt and khaki pants from behind. And that was the guy who was on call when we went in the next night. It happened just like it happened in the dream.
And their
Wow.
comment, the comment of people who have them, they become different as a result of having these. They once a person has like a precognitive experience or an out of body experience or the entire near-death experience or even part of it, uh, they're suddenly willing to talk about this stuff. Before they had these experiences, they weren't, or they were very negative about them. The other thing is that if you look back in recent history, when Raymond wrote Life After Life, uh, he named it, he gave it a name, and he gave it a definition. And up until that point, there was really no name, no modern name for these experiences, and there was no definition. In other words, people may have had an out of body experience, but they didn't want to talk about it because they didn't know it was a medically known event. And but once they read his book, all of a sudden they just came out of the woodwork. People came out and started telling about their near death experiences. The same thing is happening now with shared death experiences as a result of our book. Is that we've defined the shared death experience and have named it. Well, many people weren't familiar with the name shared death experience, although they've popped up down through medicine for hundreds of years. And so now we're starting to hear people speak freely about shared death experiences, and and
Yeah,
that's
that's a great.
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, that's a great thing you guys are doing because I remember I've
Yeah.
heard these in the ER, where people tell us something happened in surgery, and often
Yeah.
in the past it's always brushed off actually to you know hallucinations or sedation, whatever the case may be. But it's the same thing. When we talked to Bruce Grayson, I was like really grateful for the work that you guys are doing, so that people can share those stories and kind of start to process those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because Rajiv Party, uh, he as an anesthesiologist, he would deal with patients after post-operative, and heart surgery is serious, so he would spend a little bit of time with them, but not much because he was not that interested in doing that anymore. And he said he remembered one time when he had his own near-death experience. He remembered one time that he had gone in and spoken to a patient, and the patient said, "Doctor, I left my body," and he described what was going on in the operating room. And Raj said, "Oh," he gave him more medication and left, you know, because he wanted to go home and play the stock market. And then after his experience, he had the same thing happen. A doctor just
Yeah.
completely blew him off, and he said what went on in his mind was, "Oh my God, have I been doing this all along?" And so it requires, sometimes it's not medical knowledge, but it requires giving a name to something and giving a definition to it. And it also is best if you've somehow had a mystical or paranormal experience like this. That's the best thing of all. Then you become a guru, like Raymond.
Oh, no, I don't look good in a turban. I've never wanted.
It's all
Okay.
opinion though.
Yeah,
That's
it's
Yeah.
definitely.
that's
You've seen fashion lately. Yes,
you can get away with a lot,
you can.
at least here. I don't know about you guys, but let me ask you this. So, your book, Proof of Life After Life: 7 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife.
Hmm.
Um, for each of you. So, like, whoever wants to start, I guess let me start with you, Dr. Moody. For each of you, what do you think is the most compelling piece of evidence that you've come across in your research? It could be
I
literally
really think
anything.
not a matter of any one thing.
Right.
It's the whole picture. But the one aspect of the near-death experience to me is most startling is, which we can draw a plain inference from, is these life reviews in which people during their death process, people say that time disappears. They are surrounded by a panorama of every single thing they've ever done. And they re-witness not only from the perspective they had when they did each action, but they also view it through the eyes of the people with whom they've interacted. So if you see yourself doing something mean to somebody, then you feel that bad feeling yourself, or conversely. But that is a very life-changing thing for people, and it's not yet possible to draw from near-death experiences the conclusion that there is a life after death as long as we remain within the framework of Aristotelian logic. However, um, we can make a plain inference that nobody can quarrel with from this past life, from your review of your life, really, and that inference is startling enough in its own right. But what that inference is for at least some of us, life is a two-phase process. We lead it forward as the antagonist or protagonist. Time stands still and we see the same action in reverse from the point of view of other people. And that means to me, that's a startling inference that at least for some of us, life is a two-phase process. And that's startling information.
And you get in with a lot of these people, one of the words that when they have to describe a near death experience, one of the most frequently used words is timelessness. Am I correct, Raymond? That they seem to
Yeah,
be
people always say, no time, time stood still, it was
yeah,
timeless.
and it's kind of they in a lot of ways redefine time. When you deal with these, you end up thinking a lot about time. What is it, you know? And
Aristotle, pointed that out. He said, what is time? He said, it's past, present, and future. He said, but the past doesn't exist, the future doesn't exist. And try holding on to the present. It's something people have to sort of act like is real. But Georges Bataille, the great absurdist playwright, I guess he was, but he said nonsense is the end result of all sense. And that's absolutely true. As a philosopher, I was just these wonderful folks at the CIA have consulted me a couple of times on some of my stuff. You're never going to find a nicer group of nerds than these people. And I was impressed with that. To a person, these very brilliant people were, you know, taking this whole problem as a very, very serious thing. So what I'm getting at is that you don't have to be a breathless person with a blank look in your eyes to take this stuff seriously. I mean, this is
mhm.
something is going on here that is simply not accounted for in the official ideology of reality. That is the fact. And that's very scary information to a lot of people.
Yeah, and a lot of we brought this up before, but a lot of people don't like to admit they don't know. And
Yeah,
the other thing is they definitely don't like to admit it to themselves because we're all the smartest person on earth. And but it's really beneficial to say, look, here's what happened to me. I don't know what it was, what inspired it, but I'm going to keep looking because then once you keep looking at your near death experience and look at any paranormal type experience, is that it starts to open up a world to you that is unseen but not unexperienced. So,
that's right. What I've seen since I've been working on this, Justin, for decades, is that back in the 60s, when I first started investigating this thing, it was regarded as very extraordinary.
mhm,
And what happened subsequently, I think, with the advent of CPR and the technology of bringing people back from near death, it suddenly, just suddenly, with the decades, this vast number of people appeared who had always been around. I mean, these experiences always took place, but they were extraordinarily rare. And then once you get into the 70s, 80s, this is now, they're just very common. And so what that is bringing about is that it is sort of eroded or softened the boundaries between this life and the next life.
mhm,
There are many people all around who have been there. And there are many people who've had multiple cardiac arrests over a period of time, usually from heart problems. And so multiple near-death experiences. You think about the person's life course is it's like this, in and out of the afterlife, right? And there's lots of people like that. Lots of people have been there and say it's more. And so what's brought about is, like I said, it's like the barrier between this life and the afterlife is softening up.
Mhm.
Do you have a theories on what we're actually experiencing with consciousness, such as, and I guess what I'm asking about is, I know you guys have spoken about terminal lucidity in the past, um, and things like filter theory kind of come to mind with that. I just
Right.
wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that at all.
Well, that the filter theory is kind of fascinating. It's the let me see if I can get it straight in my head. Oops, I'm getting a call from you, Raymond. It's
I sorry, I
sorry.
punched
It's,
the button. Me too.
okay. Nervous fingers
Jeez.
there, buddy. Uh, it's the filter system is that a lot of we get on a daily basis millions and millions of bits of information. I mean, so much so that it's really even hard to think about it. What the nature of information is. It's not necessarily a coherent beginning, middle, and end. It's just information, and our brain filters a lot of that out, and to make a more coherent universe for us. But one of the thoughts is that people who have near death experiences suddenly, uh, I'll say death experiences, suddenly lose that filtering system, and they get a rush of information, and they struggle to process that. And there's something about that, the loss of that filtering system, that creates these events. Uh, that's one thought about the filtering system. I don't think anyone's ever been
You
able to
know,
test that. I don't know how you would even test that. Really?
I got a sort of different theory of
Sure.
consciousness, the way I look at it, and this has sort of come from life experience. And one of the major aspects was when I was a psychiatry resident. I was older than the other residents because I'd been through a PhD and a philosophy professor phase. And also, I was known for my book. And so every little town has to have a arrangement where the mayor and the chief of police and the local international celebrities don't have to go to the front door of the mental health clinic. I mean, it's just common kindness. So I was it for a year. And for a year, just these very accomplished elderly people, some of them world famous. And, and just, and there mostly because of loneliness was I quickly, they just wanted somebody to talk to, or situational stress. I'm sure you can understand, Justin, how that is with me. And constantly, I heard this, Raymond, the older I get, the more I look back, my life, I have this uncanny feeling that it's in a play or a movie or a novel or a script, right? Different words. And it's so consciousness itself is a narrative phenomenon. Think of it. It's whenever anything happens to you in your consciousness automatically weaves it into your continuing life story. There's a fascinating history of the notion of personal identity, going from Plato's view of the immaterial, immortal soul to Thomas Hobbes' objection to that's unintelligible, to John Locke's attempt to rescue it by saying that our personal identity is our consciousness and our memories. But then David Hume saying, well, I look inside myself, I don't see anything permanent. It's just the impression of the moment. But where I've come to it is your life is your story. Your personal identity is your story. And it's Kulikov effect, I think, is what
Yeah.
cinematographers or something that they've observed, that if you present any two random objects to somebody, like a tube of medicine and a pen, that the mind automatically starts trying to build a story between those two things.
Yeah.
That's how we're set up. And it's fascinating to me that when we die, God is fully aware of our life story. He's been keeping track of it.
But still, the question at a very basic level is, what is consciousness? Like you're sitting there right now looking at your screen, you're aware of your surroundings, da, da, da. What is it? How does it happen? And how far can it
Yep.
go? I look, no one's figured that out. I mean, you hear, like Viktor Frankl said, it's personhood. Consciousness is your personhood. That feels like a cop out to me. There has to be a better
Yeah, it's just a circle.
definition of that. It's just what?
Just a circle. To that, what you
Yeah, it
said,
is.
you're right. It's like circular.
It is.
There's no real
Circular
definition there.
logic, kind of.
Yeah, and I don't
Okay.
know if there's any presentation about consciousness that isn't circular, which means you
You
have
are
to break out of the circle somehow. That's one of the things we try to do. I mean, that's one of the things that this book tries to do is break out of that loop. A lot of loops out there, and this is one of them.
Well, what about let me kind of change directions for a second and talk to you guys about terminal lucidity, because it's a subject we've talked about, just kind of uh, touching on. We haven't done any real cases of it on our show. Um, so I wonder if you could maybe just break down terminal lucidity for our listeners, and then give us an example of one that you found particularly interesting.
Okay. You want to go or you want me to go, Raymond?
well, Paul. You go ahead. I'd like. I've seen them, and you've seen them. It's just
Actually, I've seen them. It's a flash of life
Yeah.
that takes place shortly before one's death. That's a very broad description of it, and it's can be quite dramatic because it takes place in people who are essentially dead or in end stages Alzheimer's. For example, there's uh, I witnessed one in 1990. Uh, and these terminal city has been called many things over the centuries, and he can go back to Aristotle with terminal lucidity, but it's a fairly recent definition of it is probably in 2017. Michael Naum just defined it, but the one I witnessed was my son had a motorcycle accident. And he broke his femur, so he was in a hospital room, and I would go in daily and work in his room and uh, see the comings and goings in the hospital. And there was a man who was moved into the room across the hall from him, who was in his end stages Alzheimer's. He was pretty much comatose, and he just laid in bed all day. And one day, his family would come in every day, 7 people, and they would come in, and he was not responsive. Finally, one day they came in, and he was totally responsive. He sat up in bed. He talked to each of them. He picked up conversations he had had with each of them when he would remembered, when it was that time when he could remember certain things. Why he could remember them, I have no idea. And he would talk about family business, and this went on for an hour or so. And he even stood up on the bed and made it kind of a platform and talked down to them. It was very unique to watch. And then he got tired. He laid back down in bed, and they were all thinking, "Wow, this is great because I'm going to be able to. We're going to be able to take Grandpa home tonight." And the next morning, when I showed up at the hospital, the bed was empty and he had died during the night. That's a typical course of what happens when people have terminal lucidity, is they become extremely lucid against all odds, and then it's kind of a dirty trick for the family because the family thinks he's now well. We can now take them home, and then they're not. They die a few hours later, or as much as 1 or 2 days later. One of the most
I would venture to.
good. No,
I'm
no,
sorry, Paul.
no. You would venture a guess.
I would think to say that everybody who deals with the terminally ill on a regular basis clinically knows about
Oh, I
this.
think that's true.
But you can't believe what you're seeing. I mean, how can this be happening? It's people light up with a light. I know it sounds crazy. It's not like from the sun or a light bulb, but it's coming from within,
Yeah,
and they're perfectly coherent. And I mean, it's astonishing.
yeah. And there is that weird brightness when people pass away.
Hmm.
But
It comes from within.
yeah,
Okay,
so
that's interesting. Can you talk
Raymond,
about that at all? Is
oh
that
yeah, we
something
do
you
actually. We talk about it in. We have a whole chapter on what light, music, and mist.
Yeah.
Light, music, and mist. That's fairly interesting. You want to switch to that? We can do that. I mean, a really great example of terminal lucidity happened in 1938, I think it was. There was a woman named Catherine Emmer who had meningitis from childhood, total brain damage. Never left the institution in Germany where she was. Could not speak. Would communicate with grunts and moans and was incontinent and on and on. This went on for like 30 some years. And then on the day before she died, she sat up, she started singing. And I have it written down here. One of the lines for what she was saying was very poetic. It's, quote, "Where does the soul find its home? Peace." And she continued to sing, and people from all over the institution came to see her because they all had known her for years. And then she essentially laid down and died. And one of the doctors who had been attending her for all these years uh, was a member of the National Socialist Party. And he showed up in a meeting where the Nazi Party, where they were advocating the euthanasia of euthanizing of mental patients. And he told them the story, this group the story. And he convinced them through this story that people with extreme mental deficits have personhood as well. You know that they're people, and they actually put the euthanizing of mentally ill patients on the back burner. I think it got back to the front burner later, but still, he was brave enough to stand up at a Nazi Party meeting and talk about one of their favorite edicts at the time.
Just recently, I talked to this very bright young man from England who was telling me that not too past that his was dying and then in the terminal phase. I think he was demented or something. But one day they went into the to visit him, and he said that he wanted to sing the song "Day oh daylight come and me wanna be go home," whatever that song.
Yeah,
And just out of nowhere, he asked everybody in the room with him to sing that song, and that went on for a little while. Every day they'd come and he'd want to sing that song. And one day the young man went back and he said, "Well, Dad, I guess we'll sing the song again today." And the man got very sad and he said, "No," he said, "we won't sing that song anymore." Pretty soon the man died, but in addition, that next day they saw in the paper that the guy who wrote that song had died.
well,
Wow, that is interesting.
Yeah.
But
Music, I mean, it's part of the foundation stone of Western civilization. The foundational document on the afterlife in the West is Plato's Phaedo, and it begins with his friends going into the prison on the day he's to be executed. And they say, "Socrates, we hear about you've become a songwriter in prison." And between the lines is that Socrates had always trivialized music or entertainment. It's not, but now here on his few death days, he's fancying himself a songwriter. Maybe but he says, "Oh no," he said, "I'm pursuing dreams and visions that tell me to pursue music." And he said, then he goes on to compare it to this Greek folk belief that just before swans die, they sing the most beautiful songs of all, swan song. And so, it's been there all along. It's rare compared to near death experiences. But if you've got a room of 200 people, you bring this up, there's going to be somebody whose relatives sang themselves out as they were dying or recited poetry. I mean, it's less common than near death experiences, but common enough that it can be studied very easily.
yeah, it's well, it's frequent. But then you get into what light, mist, and music, which is, I guess, has some kind. All these things that we talk about have tendrils that reach out to the other things we talk about. Right, Raymond? I mean, no event
Yeah,
in
it's
death
family
alone.
resemblance.
It always reaches out
Yeah,
to, like, an out of body experience goes to precognitive and things like that. So it all has tendrils. It's all kind of an odd continuum.
yeah. So
Yeah.
is the in philosophy that's called family resemblance
Hmm.
theory. The way you define a general concept is that it's not that there's some one essence of a thing that's a general notion, but rather overlapping characteristics. Wittgenstein compared it to the Churchill face, which is not. If you take a lot of Churchills, you'll find these characteristics in common. Maybe there are 6 or 7 characteristics, but not everyone has every one of them,
Right.
right? It's just, and that's how it is with near death.
Yeah.
Well, are there any elements that are, let's say, more common than others? I mean, in terms of, you see the light, the music, it seems like music, it's already come up in our conversation. I've heard you guys talk about it before, and especially in the context of a shared death experience. It seems like that would be a very profound thing for both the experiencer and the person
Yeah.
in the room with them.
I mean,
But is there,
Yeah.
it, if you look at a really great book from the 19th century called Phantasms of the Living, it was put together by three researchers, the names of which I don't remember, but I'm sure you do. And they researched a number of, just across the board, paranormal experiences. So it's full of what we now call near death experiences, but it's also full of music experiences where people are in, let's say they're in the deathbed with somebody, they're around the deathbed with someone, and out of there's 4 or 5 people around the deathbed, 2 or 3, or sometimes 4 or 5 will hear music, would hear music, and they didn't know where it was coming from. Now it was different back then. There were no radios. I mean, this is a pre-radio research. No TVs, no phonographs, and they could hear music, and sometimes the music would persist for several days after the person had died. And it's the music that a lot of guys like Tony Sikora would hear. Uh, that it's and we hear this a lot, that they hear an undefinable, a music they can't repeat.
Right.
That
In 1985, the uh, American Psychological Association meeting, they had this very nice young clinical psychologist who was also a musicologist. And he had studied, I think it was 16 or 17 cases of people who had near death experiences and had heard music during it. And he did a study where he would say, for each patient, he would say, is it more like this music or that
oh
music?
no,
And what he found was that nothing could match it,
right?
but that some things could be closer to it than others. And that George Ritchie told me a very similar thing. He said, "Raymond, this music I heard," he said, I don't know how to describe it, but he said, "I'll tell you this, it was closer to Beethoven than it was to the Beatles," was his way of characterizing it.
Not to den-
And that young man, similar finding. Yeah.
yeah, not to denigrate the Beatles, by the way.
right, right, right.
No.
Or someone who may have heard the Beatles and their shared death experience.
Oh, that would be interesting. Um,
Um,
so yeah,
Let me ask you this: do you think, or, and this is, I'm not trying to put you guys on the spot, but
please
in
do.
terms of these types of experiences,
Yeah.
like, have you seen any? Um, I'm thinking of like Mary Neal, for example, where these NDEs have real world repercussions. Are there any for you that you think about and go, wow, that's an incredible, there's no way that's a coincidence?
Yeah, the King of Jordan. The King of Jordan had heart. He was out in one of his gardens, and he had a heart attack, and he had a near-death experience, and that changed his attitude toward in the Middle East. It changed him from being combative to being way less combative, and to be searching for peace. That had real. real effect on world peace. There,
Yeah.
I would imagine there's others like that.
Yeah.
Got any, Raymond?
Well, I think it's generally true. It's like the impact is on the person. And for example, my friend George Ritchie, I eh, incredible. This is, maybe I should say this. George Ritchie, Dr. George Ritchie was from Richmond, Virginia. Okay. My mom and dad were from Porterdale, Georgia. Okay. George's experience took place in December 1943 at Camp Barkley, Texas. And I learned about it when I was an undergraduate at UVA. And because of George's experience, I started studying this. In 1974, I wrote my book. In 1975, it was getting ready to be published, and I called George for the first time in 10 years and asked him if I could dedicate my book to him. That was the only contact. I graduated from medical school in January, a couple of months later, January of 76, decided I wanted to go back to Charlottesville from Georgia to do my psychiatry residency. So in March of 1976, my wife and I went up to Charlottesville so I could do my interviews, and I talked to Dr. Ritchie briefly during that. This was the only contact. Next day, back to Georgia, where my mom and dad lived, taking care of my kids. Casually mentioned to my dad that this Dr. Ritchie was the first person I ever knew had an experience, that I had talked to him the day before, and Dad by then had heard a tape of George Ritchie's experience and said the following words to me. George Ritchie, huh? George Ritchie, Camp Berkeley, Texas, December 1943. It's very interesting. I was there, and so were you. My mom and dad moved to Camp Berkeley in early September 1943 so that my dad could go to officers candidate school. I was conceived in late September. George's experience was in December. My mom and dad moved away from Camp Berkeley December 29th, 1943. I was there in utero when this experience that changed my life happened. Subsequently, it just incredible coincidences at critical moments in my life. George Ritchie has there's
Yeah.
half a dozen of those things like that where it's this incredible coming together out of nowhere.
Mm.
How, by the way,
Oh, go ahead.
this place that Dr. Ritchie had his experience is a couple bought it a few years ago to make an exotic game farm. But the woman had a horrible fall in a tennis match and had a near-death experience. And now started reading about Dr. Ritchie now and is now making that place into a spiritual place, see, rather than these things, they wouldn't work as a novel, but this happened.
Well,
Or
well, the
they
novel,
could work as a book uh, of proofs, though, right?
they could work,
A book of
especially if they're nonfiction. I mean, what do you do? You know, that's,
Well, let me ask you guys this, because um, I've asked most people we've spoken with, and I did have one listener question for Dr. Moody, which is basically you. I mean, when people think about near-death experiences, a lot of times your name comes to mind. I would assume that that means you do receive support. People say thank you for your work and thank you for
yeah.
helping me with this grieving process or whatever it is they're going through, but also criticism.
Well,
You've
yeah.
handled yourself really well in debates that I've seen because you say exactly what you said. I don't claim to have every single answer, which is a good answer a lot of times. But how do you deal with the criticism? How have you dealt with the criticism?
Well, number one, I've heard this story a lot of times. Poor Dr. Moody was persecuted by the medical community. They almost drilled him out of the profession. And that's a great story, and great stories will not die, right? Even in the face of reality. But let me tell you the reality. When I went to the Medical College of Georgia in September of 1972, I had already been investigating this phenomenon for about 10 years. And I had friends I grew up with who were in medical school ahead of me because I'd been through the philosophy route. And so they spread the word in the faculty that this student was coming in September of 72 and had studied these experiences. Within 2 weeks, Justin, I got 8 calls from my soon-to-be professor. Dr. Moody, thank you so much for studying this, because number one, I had happened to me, or number two, it's happened to my patients. I did not get gaff from the medical community. The gaff came from the fundamentalist religion. Because this is not what Jesus says. Jesus says it's this and then you go to hell, and that kind of mentality is very annoying to me. But, the criticism it gets to you psychologically, but then you turn your humor to it, right? So, it's another thing about criticism is in philosophy, philosophy is not like propounding what you think and then expecting all your colleagues to fall over it. What you want from your colleagues is refutation. Because I put something out there and somebody refutes it, then I have learned, because I've moved closer to the truth myself. If, on the other hand, I put something out there and my colleagues say, well, I've tried, I can't refute it, then that gives me, motivation to continue that line. So it's criticism and also as a psychiatrist, you can kind of tell where somebody's criticism is not coming from reason, but rather from some personality problem or whatever.
And that's why, for the most part, why doctors write papers and why they're published in medical journals is to express not their opinion, but their research, and then actively request refutation. I mean, you see a lot of articles in medical journals that are refuted, uh, and that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not like someone made a mistake. It's like they want to know what the general opinion is of this stuff. So refutation is definitely what you want. You don't want savage brutality, which can happen sometimes.
Well, have either of you encountered criticism where you look at it and say, this is a valid criticism of this research or this topic?
Well, I think on one level, all criticism is valid. So then you have to come back and refute that. It's a everything's a circular game, and you have to come back. It's not necessarily a game, but it's what you have to do, is you have to refute the refutation.
Another thing, Justin, I love to listen to my colleagues, and I put out everything I do to my colleagues first, and if you can find any holes in things. See, but I am my best critic, because I really, many people, it's incredible to me, the people who, the way they reason is, they figure out what they already think.
Yeah, right.
And then they try to create some sort of structure of arguments to make that come out. That is, number one, not any fun. I mean, it's very defensive.
Yeah.
The way you inquire into something is you look at it and you try to knock it down. And when you try to knock it down all kinds of ways and something is standing, that gives you a little more feeling that there may be something to it.
Sure. Well, how about
by the way, it's called skepticism.
That's right.
By Puro.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not anything to do with these morons who say, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences without ever even looking up the word. That's incredible to me.
Well, that's got to be happening less, though, right? I mean, because it seems that there's a lot of people that, I mean, I know we have listeners, and I know there's a lot of content out there
Yeah.
People talk about this subject, it's more a fascination than it is a, you know,
Yeah.
people associating it with just hooey para.
Oh, there is, yeah, there is a huge amount of fascination with this, and you know, a lot of it results from their own, not necessarily their own have themselves having a near death experience or a shared death experience, but well, but just seeing it from other people. I mean, I was
Yeah.
one of our neighbors. Her father died. She was a Mormon, and she went to Utah for the funeral. And she said, I was there with all my aunts, and my aunts all sat there and told near death or shared death stories because they all were in the older Mormon culture. They took care of people until they passed away. Now that's often the job of a hospital is to keep them around till they die, but they would have them at home until they died. And she said they're all telling these stories, and as a result, that's become a big part of the Mormon religion. I'm not selling Mormonism, but I mean, but there's whole books on it. The Mormon Book of Discourses talks a lot about shared death and near death experiences, and
When I went out to BYU in 1977 or 8, I think it was 78, I spoke to the Marriott Center there at BYU to 10,000 plus people. And after my lecture, kids would come up with the Xeroxes of their old family records,
yeah,
where, from 150 years ago, they had written about grandma almost died, and she said she got out of her body. So they knew about this, forever.
but it's not a culture of well, it is a culture of skepticism by the true definition, right? The Mormons, they accept it and examine
Well,
it and
um,
refute part and don't refute.
they are good examiners.
Yeah,
Yeah. But it's kind of like an ideology that is inviolate, but they're just very neat folks, to my opinion. I mean, I just wonder why about Mormons. Just like I always ask a Mormon friend of mine. I said, "How is it that you guys look like you've never been dirty a day in your life?" So scrub and all, and just clean thinking. I mean, it just who couldn't like Mormons? Is what I say.
that's sort of how I feel. But
He said, we're not, Paul said, we're not necessarily advocating Mormonism, but we have some things.
Oh no, no, I'm not a Mormon, but
let's
I
put that
just I
across in
think
the
you're neat.
bar.
Well, let me ask you something. Let me direct this one to Paul,
Yeah,
because you've been doing this now for a long time.
yeah,
For you, and working with Dr. Moody and doing the research that you've done,
yeah.
how has it changed you or affected you from where you started?
I've always been way open to a lot of things like this. So, but it opened me up even more, and it's also made me less afraid of the phrase "I don't know," which is funny because if you get into a conference of editors, for instance, which I've been in a lot because was in magazines. Do you remember magazines, Justin? I used to be in the magazine world, and it was constant meetings and it was constant argument, and sometimes they would get pretty savage. It changed my approach toward that. Uh, Rather to listen to people's argument rather than just argue blindly. How's that? I mean, that's one thing. Uh,
Pretty good answer. Yeah.
I mean, reasonably speaking, another thing is we all have a fear of death, and I really don't think it's realistic to tell an audience uh, that they shouldn't have fear of death. Instead, I mean, I think it's something to fear, just like riding on a roller coaster can be something to fear. But instead, I
That's
what
not what it is. It scares them.
it
It's
does,
like people out some say, "I'm afraid of the pain." Count me out on that one.
yeah.
I don't want any pain.
But it's
Other people are afraid of annihilation.
right,
I'm not afraid of that. It's some people are afraid of hell. They're going to hell from their religious,
right.
or some people are afraid of the unknown.
And that's
And
where my
it's just it's different.
that's where my advice comes into them is instead of instead of promoting fear in a way, I tell them to study the literature uh, that indicates survival of bodily death. And you read Raymond's books, my books, and talk to those who have had. I like to talk, and I tell people to talk to those who have had NDEs and shared death experiences. They are quite literally all around you in any setting, and figure out a way to bring up the subject. And you'll really be surprised and glad you did, because
And
fear is often just a lack of knowledge. So yeah, I mean, don't fear education. It's in the end, it's really one of your best friends.
back in the 60s and 70s when I started, and every town has these civic clubs and they need a lecturer every Wednesday at, 2 o'clock or whatever. And as soon as one of them invites you, they all will because they got to have a lecturer every week. And so it's like I immediately found in this situation, it never occurred. And these were the movers and shakers in this little town. At that time, they were all men. Right now, as I hope it's changed, but it everyone I ever went to, somebody would come up, and one of my uh, you know little talks like that, 7 of the people there
Hmm.
had had a near death
Yeah,
experience, and so this is just very common, but it's for various reasons people didn't in the past talk about it.
yeah. Well, in the beginning, which I haven't mentioned this yet, when we were first writing The Light Beyond, that was the first book we wrote. Uh, this was in 1989,
88,
88.
1980.
What was the date, Raymond?
I don't remember that. I don't remember when it came out.
Okay, you're just so good with that usually. Uh, So anyway, I had gone to a movie with a bunch of friends, and afterwards, it was late at night. We went into a Denny's, and we're all sitting there, ordering our pancakes and talking. And they asked what was I working on now, and so I told them about Light Beyond, near death experiences. And there were about 5 of us, I think, and a couple of them said, "Well, that's all BS. It doesn't mean anything. It's just phantasms of the mind, oxygen deprivation, things like that." So courageously, I stood up in this Denny's. There were about, I don't know, 20 people in there. Introduced myself and told them what I was working on, described a near death experience. How many people in there have had experience with a near death experience, whether you've had one yourself or a relative? Almost half of the people, there's 20 people in there, almost half of them had, I think one or two had a near death experience, but the others had once it's described to them, they told their own story, and they got up and told their story in public. They had given the opportunity to do so, which made it easier for them to talk. They also might have been drunk. I don't know, because it was late. But it told me that once you bring it up in a group of people, you're going to find a lot more people than you expect, and people that you would never expect would talk about it will start talking about it. Yeah,
People talk about how courageous I
yeah,
was to bring this out. I was not anything to do with courage. I knew just from my experience of 10 or 12 years by then that anybody, especially a doctor who just took the trouble to ask around their own association network, would find the same thing.
yeah.
And that happened very quickly.
Well, for this book, for the latest book, the Proof of Life Afterlife, the 7 Reasons to Believe in the Afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
Question to both of you guys. It's kind of a 2-part question, okay? One, what motivated you to come together and get this book out there, since you've already written together quite a bit?
Wow.
And 2, why should people read this one in particular?
Yeah. I want to talk about that just for a second. And
Yeah.
both Paul and I have noticed that there is this raft of people now who have arisen who were kids when all this was publicity, and they're entering now into midlife or whatever. And as these are questions that just naturally come up with life. And so that's one of the main things. I just hear it all the time. It's like people I meet who are late 20s, early 30s, or even into early midlife have never heard about this
Hmm.
because they weren't even born when this came out.
Yeah. And they're curious about it. I mean, everyone's curious about death, and they're all curious. Everyone's curious about what happens when we die. What drove us to do this book on shared death experiences was that for years we had they would pop up when we would be researching near death experiences, and there'd be a shared death experience, and Raymond first said, "Well, that's a shared death experience," and he stuck a name to it, and we would have a few in all the books that we did, but we never focused entirely on those. And then we, over the years, had realized that these things are objective experiences. So near death experiences are subjective. That means that Justin, if you have a near death experience, you're the only one who can experience it, and you're the only one who can really describe it. And that makes it subjective. But if someone else experiences your death experience, your near death experience, if they're able to, as we've found in the past, to repeat your life review while you're having it, if they're able to precognitively see things that are happening to you, and report that and have that reporting confirmed, those are objective experiences. And an objective experience in any court of law, I think, carries a lot more weight than a subjective experience. And so that's why that's mainly, from my point of view, why this book is important, because it's an objective uh, exploration of death, and that's why I think it's super important.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Well, obviously we're gonna promote this episode and the book and give your full bios and everything. But where can listeners find the two of you if they want to learn more?
From
Uh-huh.
Raymond, they can find him at lifeafterlife.com. He was lucky enough to get that website. I think there's now 100 people who tried to get it. So his is lifeafterlife.com, and mine is paulperryproductions.com. And I would even be willing to give my email if you don't mind. It's
Sure.
it's p perry 87 at cox.net. That's cox.net. So that's PPERRY 87 at cox.net.
And God knows that I can't use computers, so he hasn't sent me an email yet.
It's a black hole.
We found out he can use the phone pretty well, though.
Well, yeah, with the help of, what is she, 16 now? So,
Right.
Well, before we wrap this up, I just was
Mhm.
thinking about this. I mean, are you planning on working on anything else together in the future, or is this kind of it for right now?
well, a couple of things. I mean, one, I'm working on, I make documentary films as well. And I did one it's on Amazon and Apple and everything else, since everything's on everything now, called Afterlife. And I did that several years ago. Raymond's in that, and we're going to take this book and turn it into. Right now, the thinking is to turn it into 7 individual master classes,
Oh, wow.
and
Okay.
do a master class of proof of life after life. Yeah, so that's it. If you have any money, call me. Only kidding.
That's a great idea, though.
Yeah, it works. Yeah,
Okay.
so that's cool.
Mm.
And then what else? What are
That's what
we
we're
going to do? We can't look too far in the future, because we always end up changing our mind.
and also because I'm 79, I almost died 2 years ago in reality. I mean, it's what's the reality here? And I figure, it's like so interesting about life, Justin. It's like when you're a kid, you hear this thing about the happiest life is a life of service to others. That sounds like an ideal, right? Then you get into midlife, then it becomes an aspiration. By the time you're 79 years old, it's just a fact of experience because you learn just think about it. Whenever you're trying to deal with yourself and I want to do this for me, you're always miserable. It's only when you just decide, hey, it's fun to help other people. That's when life gets happy. It's just a fact. Like I said, it's not an ideal.
Yeah, but that's great advice for people listening. I mean, I think especially in the time that we live in with social media and sort of this self-focus and self I don't know, public promotion, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that message. So I really appreciate you guys. We all do. The producer
Thanks.
and Alexander, everybody's really grateful you guys took the time to do this. Um,
Well, this